somehow the United States still ends up being at the center of it. Or somehow, depending on who's writing it, there's some other interest that is sort of driving the story. And oftentimes those interests, historically, or at least in the 20th century as these histories have been produced, they've been about racial division, they've been about class division, they've been about, sometimes there's been a feminist agenda, behind, and that's really almost the agenda that's driving the interpretation of the history. And so I end up sometimes, and maybe this only happens when you read a lot together all at once and everything, but as it piles on, I sometimes feel like we still are at the margins of our own story. The second thing that I become very aware of sometimes, and this is undoubtedly part of it as well, is that as a Cherokee citizen living in this moment, living today, I am not the audience that the author is writing for. Those Cherokees were in the past somehow, right? And the audience that's being written for is an academic audience, is a popular audience, is a governmental audience. It's some other audience sometimes, but it's not me. Maybe it's me as an academic, but not me as a Cherokee. And I have sometimes those reactions to the way that the histories have been produced. So I just want to give a couple of things. What I really spoke about a couple of years ago was that in relation to this verse critique that I have had, the Cherokees are sort of peripheral to their own story. I critique the binaries, what I call the binaries that are frequently produced out of these histories. Somehow there's a story of opposition, there's a story of conflict. The common binaries are around mixed bloods and full bloods as the stories are told, or the elite classes and the traditionalist classes as the stories are told. And of course the Ross Bridge, when we speak specifically about the Trail of Tears itself and about this era. And so I guess conflict, oppositions, I guess these things are sort of neat ways to define different kinds of positions that people may be holding, or they maybe lend drama to the story. We couldn't possibly have a dramatic story here, or an interesting story, if there wasn't some kind of conflict, right? That sometimes seems, I guess, to be where people are coming from on this. And so I have written, and spoken critiques of these kinds of binaries and the flattening of complexities that take place as a result of that. But even more than that, about the disservice that it does to the contemporary Cherokee people of today to write the histories in the ways that they have very typically been written. Because I teach classes where, I'll never forget this, I had a participant, an employee of the Cherokee Nation one time in a class. We got to this part of the whole thing, talking about the Trail of Tears, talking about the Ross Bridge, the whole thing. And he actually read a little bit of the history. And his final remark was, boy, those mixed bloods just really screwed over those full bloods, didn't they? And it's just like, oh, how much that hurts to hear from our own people this type of interpretation, how much that we can internalize that sort of thing. When we know, those of us who are in the room, who are deep researchers and deep historians, that the story is so much more complicated than that. But that's what we hear sometimes. That's what we internalize if we don't have that deeper understanding, that deeper knowledge. So I'm I'm always very, very excited by the interpretations that monkey wrench the binaries, right? That just throw a real problematic sort of perspective into it. And one of the things that really interested me so much about Brett Rigg's presentation, the first keynote address here, was that when I read William McLaughlin, for instance, as the historian, which I'm sure many of you have. Here's a historian who I think, although an excellent researcher and a lot to offer, but clearly there's a class-based interpretation and a class agenda that's sort of operating in his work. And one of the things I've always remembered are the constant descriptions of the Cherokees as being a poor people, a people who were in poverty. And I thought, why are they poor? They're living in the same manner as whites on the frontier, you know, is there any difference really? And the suggestion almost seems to be that it's because of the class hierarchy, that stratification that was emerging in the Cherokee Nation, that this is causing impoverishment among the subsistence classes of people, you know, in the same way that you might make sort of that analysis about the United States, you know, the economic systems of the United States. And so it's very interesting to hear a presentation that says, well, they were poor people, but maybe it was because of a volcano in Nicaragua, you know, and maybe it was because of climate change, and, you know, it isn't anything that necessarily has to do with the more typical types of interpretations. So I just give that as an example. I love those pieces of information, you know, really can provide us with so much more depth to the picture. In relation to my second point, that I, as a Cherokee, and that we, as Cherokees, are not necessarily the intended audience for the histories that are produced about us. This is one of the things that is particularly my agenda, if you will, in the way that I approach the teaching of this history. And the statement that I've taught 9,000 people, I have to say about 9,000 people have been taught this, but I certainly haven't taught all of them. G. Smith originated this course, and I followed, and Kathy Mulholland teaches this class, also Jean Norris, who is here, also teaches this class, and we have several other instructors in between. All of us, about 9,000 people have probably taken this course. And so we'll all take different kinds of approaches to it, and that's absolutely correct. But when I teach these classes, and when all of the people I just mentioned teach these classes, we are predominantly teaching other Cherokees. We are teaching their history to them, right? And it becomes a very, very internal dialogue as a result of that. And we have a different reason for doing it, perhaps, than simply a matter of information that it goes beyond being academic. We have a nation-building agenda, quite frankly. We're open about that in what we do with this. So the first thing that has to happen is to bring the Cherokees themselves, of course, to the center of the story. And the United States feminist agendas, class agendas, agendas about race have to become peripheral to our stories. First of all, I challenge at least, the prevailing themes of intra-tribal conflict on the basis of class and race, mixed bloods and full bloods, elites and traditionalists. I don't know that that serves us in any way. I can see just as much evidence for cooperation and collaboration and strategy and strategic use of various peoples, of various experiences and various economic statuses. And why are we not telling that story? Isn't that a much more valuable story for us as Cherokee people? So to bring that type of interpretation to the forefront. And when we start to do this, it opens the space for nation building, as I just said, and for empowerment of our people to begin to know their history, maybe not only in a different way, but in the only way that many of them have really known anything about it very much. One of the things about writing histories where it's presumed that Cherokees are not the consumers of it is because for the most part they probably aren't. Most of our people do not, in my experience at least, read this history. And they get it, you know, through some kind of oral accounting sometimes, or somebody else tells them a story, you know, that this is something that happened. But you know, like most Americans, I suppose, we're not people who are likely to sit down and read a history book about ourselves. So when we get to the portion of the class about the Ross Ridge, the Trail of Tears, and the divisions between Ross and Ridge, to my surprise, when I'm teaching employee classes, most people weren't even aware of that. Most people didn't even know necessarily what the division was. When I teach community classes, there's a slightly larger percentage of people who have had an interest in Cherokee history, who know about the division. But even there, most people are unaware of it to any great degree. And for us to sit in here and these, with the exception of a couple of panels or a couple of sessions in recent years, this is something that we don't even really talk about. I mean, it's presumed, I think, and we know about it, and we go on to other things. But this most fundamental story of division, at least as the way mainstream historians have put it out there, is something that our own people in contemporary times, for the most part, are unaware of. So there's an opportunity there that opens up, right, that you don't even have to overcome sometimes some of the prevailing interpretation, that can go directly to something that is much more empowering. As a result of this, I find that in most of the classes that I teach, people don't have a strong perspective one way. They don't take a position one way or another on the debates. And then I run into occasionally in the community classes, even among people who know about it, they still don't necessarily take a strong, Ross good, Ridge bad, or vice versa kind of position. With the exception of an occasional individual here and there, and one of them, of course, is our beloved Virginia Van Perry, who many of you know, who takes a very, very, very strong position on it. But we are able to open the situation up, and through role plays that she Smith had developed, and then the Weavers, Jason, Laura Weaver, introducing their game the other day. I'm very excited to try this out, because when we are able to go into the actual strategic perceptions about what the interests were and why people were doing the things they were doing, this becomes a whole tangled mess, And we do that at a couple of points in the class, and we do it around the Nancy Ward story also, which I think most of you are familiar with. And Virginia's remark about that, I will never forget this. She said, "Oh, she's made me start thinking differently about Nancy Ward. I hope she doesn't make me like those rich people." But that's about as entrenched an individual as I've ever encountered on this topic, right? And bless her, she's got her, she's got her reasons, but we've got my sense about the whole thing oftentimes is that we, as a people, as the individual Cherokees in my classes, they don't have a strong position one way or another on it. When they're coming into the class, they don't know the story well enough to take a strong position on it. And so I always presume that that's kind of where most Cherokee people are at these days. I was reminded that Virginia is not alone in this at the Sequoia conference a couple of weeks ago, when there was a panel about a recent PBS production around the Trail of Tears. And it will not surprise anyone here to learn that Councilman Jack Baker was the provocateur in the whole instance. But bringing up the subject of possible payments that were accepted from the federal government by the Treaty Party. I hope I'm not stealing your thunder on that, but I think that, yeah, it was brought up in another panel today as well. So, did you miss that? Jack is the provocateur. That's what I said. Thank you. But that session at the Sequoia conference just ended up in an out-and-out brawl. Right? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it was, and he started it. So, and so it was interesting, because this was a group of academics and Cherokee people, who tend to sort of stay at an unemotional, dispassionate level of things sometimes, right? We're all sort of trained in doing that, I guess. And suddenly everybody was in there slugging, you know, verbally at least. And Chris Eyre, who was the director of this PBS production, makes the remark that, you know, somebody told me that Cherokees don't do that like we said in film. They don't talk over each other. They don't yell at each other. That's not right, the way we portray them. And here they are doing it right in front of me. So there are still passions about this. There's more than I am aware of sometimes when I have taught this class. One of the things, however, that coming out of the class is that we're able to look at the debate between the two sides in a somewhat more, bring more complexity to it. We are also able to clarify many of the common misconceptions that people have around the Trail of Tears and the 3 S's, or what I call them, the stockades, the soldiers, and the starvation, right? Being among them. So we clarify those kinds of misconceptions. But one additional sort of misconception that we want to talk about, and this is where I really want to go to today, is around the roundup itself and the idea of the way that the roundup went down. One of the things that people believe is that it was a total surprise to Cherokees when soldiers showed up on their doors. Right? And they are frequently surprised to discover that there was a 2-year time period in there when the Cherokees could have gone quite willingly, taken their personal possessions, gone with the support of and protection even of government troops, I suppose, but that they didn't do that. They also think that they didn't know that the soldiers were going to show up on their doorsteps on a certain date, and of course handbills were slapped up around giving exactly when they would be in the area to take people out of their homes in that area. And so one of the questions that repeatedly comes up when we talk about this in the classes that I teach, and Ed Hinshaw brought this up in the session earlier this morning as well, is why didn't they go? Did they not know that removal? I think Ed's question was, how could Ross not have foreseen that this was going to happen? How did the people, did they really not know this, that this was going to take place? And this is where I want to go in terms of taking this talk today out of kind of the academic realm and bringing it down to the ground of our people. Because when we talk about Ross and Ridge, in the histories as they've been written, there's a hero and there's a villain. And Dr. Smith alluded to this in his presentation, and it's very similar to the way that we've been teaching it for throughout these years. There's a hero and there's a villain in the story. And generally, Ross is the hero because he's got 90% of the people behind him, right? And in hindsight, it looks like that's the right position and so forth. And most of the texts are written that way. One or two times, somebody's kind of flipped it over and said, the Ridges kind of had a position too. And they were not that bad. And they had some intentions as well that were honorable in terms of trying to save this nation. But that perspective is much rarer to be able to find. When we debate this in the class, I ask 2 questions of the students. I say, first of all, in hindsight, when you look at the Ridge position that they were trying to basically save their nation, and that they saw, perhaps with more experience, more clarity, more complexity than the majority of the people did, what was going to happen here. Do you think that's a valid position to take? And I'll tell you, today, about 98% of Cherokees in the classes I taught, at least, they say, yeah, they did. They saw, further down the road, more clearly, what was about to take place here. But then the follow-up question is, does it make their action right then, to sign the treaty? And 100% in the classes I taught, at least, say, no, it still didn't make it right. That was still a subversion of the structures of the Cherokee government, of the Constitution of the Cherokee government. So we can see the benevolence of the motivation, the motive, but still disagree with the action in the scenario. To take this back to the question, did Ross truly not see that this was going to happen? Did the people truly not see that this was going to happen? I tie it to the fact that they had 2 years to go ahead and go. They slapped handbills up around the nation telling people exactly when troops were going to be approximately in their regions to pick people up. And yet the people sat in their homes and waited for them to do that. We hear these stories about escape from the Trail of Tears, all of these romanticized kinds of stories. If anybody wanted to escape, they could have done it right there, probably. Just left their home and not have been there when the soldiers came. And yet, in the majority, people did not do that. They sat there and they waited for people to come and pick them up. Sometimes, after working with this for so many years, and I'm sure it's true for Chief Smith and for Kathy and for Jean and for so many of the other people in this room who work deeply with this history, it feels sometimes like they're just speaking to you almost, like they're just showing you something sometimes that you haven't, when you go over the same things again and again and again, suddenly there's an insight to something, that's what it was. And for me, one of the insights that I think addresses Ed's question earlier today, why did they sit there? Why did they really not see that this was going to happen? One of the insights is, yes, they did. They saw it was going to happen. They absolutely knew it was going to happen. How could you not know that this was going to happen? Ross knew it was going to happen. Everybody knew this was going to happen. I doubt at the moment when it took place that there was a Cherokee anywhere, really, who didn't know that this was going to happen. And yet they sat there and they waited for it. And the insight that came to me at some point was that, they are making sure. They are sitting there, they're going to make sure that the whole world sees what is about to take place here. If in fact this does happen, which they're pretty sure it will, they are not going to go in a way that is unseen, that is gradual, that is bit by bit, that is piecemeal, that is under protection. If this happens, they are going to make sure they go together, they make sure that they go, that they will be forced out, so that will be seen. And it became, this was a growing sense that I had that this thing of refusing to go and sit in their homes even to the day when they knew the soldiers were going to come and pick them up was such a deliberate action on their part that gradually began to be my feeling after teaching this class for several years and working with this material and thinking about, and just intuiting what was going on here perhaps. And a few years ago when we were in Chattanooga, we took a bus tour, and Jack wrote a letter by the Reverend Stephen Foreman on that bus tour. And I'm going to have to paraphrase the letter because I didn't have it in front of me, and I know I've inserted some of my own imaginings into it. But I think it's still right. The emotional tone of this is correct. And as I recall, or maybe this is just me inserting it in there, but surely if it is, this is how he felt. The letter begins something like, I'm sitting in my cabin. It is the last night that I will ever spend in my cabin. Paraphrasing. They're coming. They will come tomorrow to come to get me. This will be the last night, perhaps, that I will look out upon these mountains that I have seen for all of my life. And he goes on throughout the letter, and basically it's a debate about the dilemma that he's had with himself over the many years, if I'm remembering it correctly. Should I have done this? Was there something we could have done differently? I have thought so many times, perhaps I could have taken this action. It's there. They've considered it all, and there is nothing that they haven't looked at and that they haven't thought about. And he said it. His conclusion is, I come to this moment, to this night, basically, saying there's nothing else I could have done except exactly what I am doing, to sit here and to wait with my people, basically, for them to come to take us. There has been no other option. This, in fact, has been the most appealing option, the only one, perhaps, that this man could see. And Jack read that letter, and it, for me at least, it really confirmed the deliberateness of the decision that so many Cherokees, not even those of the educational attainment or whatever, Reverend Foreman, but that so many Cherokees, at some visceral level, they understood very well that this was going to happen, but they were going to force it. They were deliberately going to force the issue. So they saw it. And the way I present this oftentimes to the classes and lecture is that here's the high ground. And they're not going to let it go. They're not going to relinquish it to anybody else. They are going to stand on it, and they are going to refuse to do anything but. On the other hand, we have the Ridges, and I believe probably the Rosses and the members of the elite in that group as well, who know that this is going to happen and who are pragmatists about the situation. And so they're making plans for it. They're signing treaties that are really pretty strong treaties if you have to do this. There's some good provisions in that treaty. They're doing what they have to do, they believe, to make sure not only, as I heard it stated, that the people, the choice is not the land and the people, I don't think. The choice is the land or the nation. And the nation is the people, of course. And so is the land. And so what's the choice? There is no good choice. So we have the pragmatists who know this is going to happen. We're going to make sure that we can try and do this in the very best way possible for our people and our nation. And we have the 90% who also know that this is going to happen, but who know that this is a tremendous injustice, that this is an ethnic cleansing. This is the language we would use about it today. Right? And they are not going to have this happen again without the world seeing it. And so they sit and they wait for this to happen. So, and I just got permission from a friend of mine to use this quote. And many of you have heard this quote already, because I use it in the class. But in this story, as I see it, there are no villains. There are only heroes. There is no division on what is the ultimate goal, which is to somehow pull our people and our nation through this. There's no divide on that. And there's no division within the Cherokees even until Andrew Jackson refuses to. And so who's the real culprit here becomes the question. Who actually causes the division? It's not racial differences among the Cherokees. It's not class differences among the Cherokees. This is not what causes the split. It's the United States that causes the splits to occur. And this is something that we can see in any Indian nation, right? For so many peoples around the world who have had to face processes of colonization, is that there are divisions about how to respond to that. And so that's what this is as well. That's all. And so the ultimate goal is the same. And a very, very brilliant contemporary Cherokee man has stated it this way. And a man who's not only brilliant in intellect, but brilliant in heart and soul. And he has said, John Ross knew the hearts of people, but John Ridge saw the future of the nation. And many of you know this quote, because I've used it in classes, right? And I want to clear that this is Shane Smith who has said this, because it's been attributed to people, non-Indians from the 19th century and different groups of people. But this is a Cherokee today who says this. And if you were going to put something on a bumper sticker, that would be it. I would think about this thing. So there is no division. Thank goodness for the pragmatists. Thank goodness that 90% held the high ground. Thank goodness for all of them. We have very few stories about the Trail of Tears. So Troy reminded me of a conversation that several of us had at the Cherokee Nation talking about this several years ago, that there aren't that many stories about it. And I think it was mentioned, Sarah, I overheard in your interview yesterday saying that they didn't want to talk about it, right? Something like that. That's what, and so many of us, that's what we heard. Our ancestors didn't want to talk about this. It's really special to be in Illinois, I think, and to be in this part of Illinois, because this was the worst of it. I have no doubt of that. This was the worst of it for them. And I've been to Mantle Rock before. I've crossed the river near Golconda before. I've been to these places before. By myself, never with my nation, people from my nation around me. I've read Daniel Buttrick's journals. I've read a lot of things about Illinois and about this part of the trail. But when I got to Mantle Rock yesterday, and I looked at those journals again, and I read through those passages that were on display and which had been highlighted, and I think Beverly Baker had highlighted them, isn't that correct? The horror of all of this really slapped me between the eyes suddenly. I was reading just entry after entry, and he records them fairly dispassionately, I think. 12 people died here, 4 died, there was a 12-month-old baby that died, this person died, that. But it's just line after line after line of this. And why do we not have stories? Why do they not tell the stories? These people are in the middle of one of the most horrific wars ever, is the way I have to look at this. I mean, I think that veterans, perhaps, are the only people who could maybe understand or have some kind of comparison to make here about what is happening when you are living in a situation day by day by day, and you cannot get out of it, and there's just death all around you at every moment. And that these are your people, these are your family members, these are your communities that are around you. How could you speak of it afterwards? How could you ever bring those images up again? I appreciated so much some of the speeches yesterday. The gentleman, and I'm ashamed that I hadn't remembered his name, but he was from the governor of Kentucky. He was the representative from the governor's office that spoke. The eloquence of that speech. And what I really appreciated was the linking of it to all of humanity. That this is an experience that all of humanity can certainly relate to from the standpoint of being people of good heart and people of goodwill. That you would never want this to occur. The speech of our own chief, of Chief Smith, reminding us that we are here, we are a nation, we still fight for this sovereignty, we still fight for this legacy, and to bring it forth. Now, those people wouldn't speak of it, they couldn't speak of it, but nevertheless, they made certain that the world saw it, and that the world knew it, and that the world would never forget it, and they made certain that we would know it as their descendants. Even though they didn't speak of it, that in itself said volumes, didn't it? This is the event, this Trail of Tears. This is the event that we hang our identity on today. We can talk about other things in Cherokee history, about allotment, which ultimately was so much more devastating to our land, our government. We're still trying to recover from that more than 100 years later. But the Trail of Tears is the event that defines us ever after, it seems. Whenever I go into a group of Cherokee people and they don't necessarily know each other, they'll get to talking to each other and My ancestor was on the Trail of Tears, and they'll name the ancestor, great-great-grandmother, great-great-grandfather, whoever it was, right? But my ancestor was on the Trail of Tears. That's what defines us. That's what makes us so. That's what makes us a Cherokee, it seems like, when we get together with each other, among ourselves. I believe the subtext of that is my ancestors survived, therefore I am here. I am here. There are no villains. There are only heroes. They pulled us through all together. Thank goodness for all of them taking the positions they took, the strength with which they fought and battled their positions. Because every one of them did that, because none of them backed off, because every one of them came in there with everything they had, because nobody relinquished the high ground, and because some of them were practical. We made it. We made it. They gave us a future. And the thing they want is for us to pay it forward. And that's what we do when we come together. So those are my thoughts. I hope there was some kind of structure to them. They sort of felt like they were just all over the place. But maybe Illinois will do that to you, you know? Because it just feels pretty palpable around here, doesn't it? Okay, that's it. Thank you.